Hello, folks. It's me again. I am looking at Chapter 6. I'm going to bring it up on screen and we can get started. All right. I'm not going to fool around with making it full screen. It's more than enough. This chapter is unique in that it looks at dissident terrorism. That's a term that's fairly unique, and I think one of the author's topics. It's actually a pretty good one too. He has 5 pieces to this discussion. The first, examples from history, then perspectives about violent dissident action, and then dissident terrorism, and there's a difference. The targets and weapons that they could use, and I really like this. This is a good hint for your final project. And then he talks about how dissidents are using the new terrorism, and we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so examples from history. We have John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southern sympathizer at about the time of the Civil War. He's the one that killed President Lincoln. Why? Because Lincoln won the war. And he assassinated him or shot him, and then shouted, "Thus always to tyrants," so death to tyrants. And he believed that he was doing the right thing and paying back this northern aggression. That's dissident. There's also this very famous case from Chiapas, which are native people in Mexico. And I put question mark because I'm not sure they were terrorists more than they did some things that surprised the government of Mexico. They really were about native rights, so Aboriginal rights or native people in Mexico and their rights. They wanted that the state funding would come to them and not just to the rich people in the country. So they wanted education, social welfare, healthcare, land rights, and they created this kind of Robin Hood image: steal from the rich and give to the poor. But they used technology to organize. So here are these, now these are the poorest of the poor in Mexico, and yet they were able to use technology to their advantage. They created what is called net war, and I'll explain a little more about that in a little bit. So violent dissident action can come in several varieties. There's 3 categories that he lists. Revolutionary terrorism, that's where you want to change the country. Sub-revolutionary is where you want to change part of society. And establishment terrorism is when the rich folks fight back, okay? Typically, dissidents have a world vision. You know, we're part of a bigger movement. For example, communism, there's a world communist movement going on, those kinds of things. But then they can also be nihilistic, just destroy everything. And they can be nationalistic. Now in America, nationalism is associated with the neo-Nazi white supremacist movement. In other countries, nationalism wouldn't be that same thing, but that's how it's been used in America, the nationalist. So in other countries, it would be perhaps the dominant group in society. Here are some characteristics of dissident terrorism. And this is true of a lot of, this first one is especially true of a lot of terrorism. It's asymmetrical, meaning there's one side that has the vast majority or superiority of weapons and tactics, and then there's the poor lowly folks that are using terrorism because they can't fight. They don't have tanks, and they don't have bombers and those kinds of things. Now, what we found out through the Chiapas movement is you can force multiply any group by using net warfare. And so when you read about that, I want you to think about how a small group can seem a lot larger, a lot more dangerous than they really are through the use of the internet. Of course, dissident terrorism can be anti-state. It can be communal. Let's bring together our ethnic group. It can be sectarian. You see that in, there's lots of, this chapter is filled with examples. Lebanon, Sudan, Northern Ireland, Israel, Yugoslavia. I've been to Northern Ireland. I've been to Israel. I've been to Yugoslavia. Haven't been to Sudan, haven't been to Lebanon, but I was literally a stone's throw from Lebanon, and seen some of these things happen. There's ideological terrorism. See this in places like Greece and Angola and Indonesia. I've been to two of those places. And it's interesting when you talk to people, like in Greece, there's a real kind of leftist slant to many of the groups. That's because young people can't find jobs. You know, when you got 40% unemployment, oh my goodness, people can't get a job, they can't buy a house, they can't get married, they can't have children because they don't have any prospects. Many of these groups believe that defeat is unthinkable. Victory is just one more campaign away. In some ways, that's delusional because they're fighting a very powerful state. But this is how they think. Now, this next part, this is going to be useful for you when you do your final project. There's symbolism to targets. Targets aren't just chosen. It's not just any building. It's the World Trade Center. Okay? That was why that was chosen. The Pentagon, embassies, certain people, passenger carriers. So American Airlines carries a U.S. flag on it. That's a bigger target than some know-nothing airline. There are different types of weapons. There's high-range weapons, weapons of mass destruction, WMD. They're typically known as CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear. But there are other weapons that are emerging that would be in this high range. Pulse weapons, for example. Medium range are conventional weapons like a rocket launcher, a grenade launcher, machine guns, that kind of thing. But then we have low range weapons, homemade weapons, an IED. You can make a bomb out of household chemicals. You can make a bomb out of a crock pot. And we've seen that happen, the Boston Marathon bombing. We saw that happen. And then, of course, there's typical weapons, firearms, assault rifles, RPGs, PGMs, common explosives, triggers, and all this other stuff. The point is that you can create a lot of havoc using low-range weapons. That's just a thought. Let's see. The last topic of this chapter is about dissidents using the new terrorism. Are they willing to use new weapons? And do they have morals? People think, oh, terrorists are crazy, but they do follow some rules. And suicide bombers are an example of how new weapons, human weapons, are being used in many places. Israel, Lebanon, many other places. I had one student, and she wanted to write about female suicide bombers. And when I asked her why, it was because she was from Sri Lanka, and their females are the suicide bombers. And she wanted to write about it. Well, she got a job out of my class, went over to the Rand Institute, went on, and she's getting a PhD now, but she works for the FBI. So she found an area that interests her, and she turned it into a career, and a pretty good career. Small groups are cellulars. You've probably heard this term, cells, so that only a certain number of people are known to each other, and then the larger organization doesn't even know who they are, doesn't need to know, and that way they can't be caught and then roll everybody up. So cellular organization is a small group of people that are limited in who they know and what they know, but they can be very dangerous. There's the other phenomenon of the lone wolf, the person who is by themselves. Now, Ted Kaczynski, he was the Unabomber, and he bombed people for, I think it was almost 20 years, 17 years. And he did all kinds of bombs, but he hated technology. He even typed his notes, no computers, typed them. He did things like he would take a 2x4, he would hollow out underneath it, put a bomb there, and then he would have nails sticking up. He would set it in the middle of the road, and here comes a good Samaritan that stopped going, oh, I'll pick that and throw it off to the side of the road so nobody loses their tires. But when they picked it up, boom, they'd lose an arm. He did some really interesting stuff, interesting in the, he was crazy, in that he was this lone wolf that they couldn't catch for nearly 2 decades. It was finally his brother that turned him in. Interesting. All right, that's this chapter. I hope you are staying up with your reading. I hope you are going to do well on your testing. Please take care of yourselves. Have a good day. Turn that off.